Thank you, and welcome to my talk on scalable front-end architecture with Vue 3's Composition API and Composable functions. I am Will Marple. I'm a lead full-stack developer at an agency called Black Airplane. I specialize in PHP, Laravel, MySQL in the back end. I have experience with a number of different front-end frameworks, but Vue is by far my favorite. I use it every day at the agency, and I love to get the opportunity to evangelize and speak and talk about Vue. So I'm super excited to be here today and talk to you a little bit about my approach in building out web app front ends with Vue, specifically Vue 3. So let's jump in. I think it's good to talk about the progression as we continue to add more and more components into an app as it's growing larger and larger, and some of the challenges and patterns that arise before we talk about the architectural pattern itself. So every Vue application is going to start out as just a few components. And when an app is in its nascent phases, it's easy to think about your Vue components as just their own little microcosm containing their own isolated state or data, their own functionality like methods and computed properties, et cetera. And for a time, that paradigm can hold up. But as our app grows and we have more and more components, we start to run up against some challenges. So the majority of my talk is going to be on reusing the functionality. And when I say functionality, I'm talking about methods, computed properties, watchers, lifecycle hooks, that sort of thing. We are going to touch a little bit on state and data, but specifically on reusing the functionality. As your app grows, you can see here we've got multiple independent component trees. And this might be something like an expandable drawer on the left, you might a nav bar at the top, all the components that are in your main pane of your app, that sort of thing. And it's really tough. It starts becoming really tough to laterally share that data across many trees and then also reuse that functionality. And in the beginning, you might be tempted to start doing something like copying and pasting functionality. And that's not a great practice, obviously, because it's not super maintainable. We're running into maintainability challenges where we're having to update the same code in many different places. And that will then evolve into creating reusable Vue components that contain that functionality. And that's a great practice. And it's something that you should be great at. But the pattern that I'm going to be sharing is kind of in addition to reusable Vue components. So let's move on to the paradigm of how I think about the three major concerns at the 10,000-foot view, if you will, of a Vue app. In the outer shell, I have my presentational components. These are, I'm primarily looking to my .vue components to hold my template, DOM structure, and my styling, and any functionality and data that I can be reasonably sure is unique to that specific component. In the middle layer, I've modularized the functionality that I'm pretty confident I'm going to have to share across 2, 3, or even more components during the build out of my app. And then in the middle, I have my data. So any dynamic web application front end is going to have to take in some data from somewhere. And when we organize it in a global state management tool like Pinia, it just frees that presentational layer from data flow concerns of having to prop drill and emit back up in a chain, or provide and wrap a component tree or several component trees in a parent component, so that we can provide to both Pinia and global state as a pattern, frees your presentational layer from that constraint and allows it to really just be concerned with how it should be structured for presentation visual purposes. So before we move on to some real code, let's define, when we're talking about Option API, Composition API, what does that actually mean? How do they play together? So Option API is what, if you're not familiar with it, is what we've all been used to for a long time. It's how we've written our functionality for quite some time. We've got some data here, just your typical counter example. some methods, a lifecycle hook. This should all feel very familiar. This is the equivalent code rewritten with Composition API. So in my approach to Vue 3, or how Vue 3 has evolved me, Composition API has completely replaced Option API for me. I don't write any new components with Option API anymore. And as I was learning it, I found that there is a convenient way to find opportunities refactoring existing components and moving some of that functionality into Composition API as I go along. So let's take data as an example. Data is no longer bound inside the data method from the Option API. In Composition, you're free to compose your logic in any way that you see fit. And for me, a lot of times I find myself organizing my logic by logical concern. So you can see I started to kind of shift the data close to the methods there for the counter. So I have all of the logic that makes the counter work in one place. And that makes it easy as I run up against the need to take that counter engine, put it in a composable, and reuse it multiple places. I could just take that code block, literally just remove it out and put it in a composable function, and then pull it in both of those places. So Composition API has been a big game changer for me in that way. So with that, let's actually jump into some code here. Using Stackblitz for this demo, I just wanted to give a shout out to them real quick because I saw it demoed at VConf last year, and it really blew me away. We've got basically VS Code and a dev server and everything all running in browser. Like none of this code I'm going to show you today had to be pulled down locally and run locally. So really cool tool if you get the chance to check it out. But in our first phase of this code demo, we've got what should be pretty familiar here, the Option API I just showed you on the slide. And I wanted to stop here real briefly and show how I would approach finding an opportunity to refactor this. Let's imagine that this is a component in an existing project that I have, and I want to start refactoring it. So the setup function can actually just live in here with the Option API functionality, and we can start to pull in some of this. So let's do that with our data. We're going to declare some variables that match the data, and this is an object, so we're going to make it reactive, and we'll pull in the value for that. You guys will have to forgive me. Typing live is hard. And we're going to make our app name as well, and that's a primitive, so we're going to wrap that in a ref. Okay, and we will pop that in there, and then we have our counter as well.
Really quick, I'm blind as a bat. Bats actually aren't blind, y'all. It's off of like Sonos, whatever.
How's that?
Any better? I think it's a little bit better. Can you go a smidge more? We still having enough room for everything?
Yeah.
Oh,
gotcha.
That's the magic right there. That is the magic. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Sure. And okay, cool. So we've got our counter variable as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and just blow this away. And our app's going to break because there's a couple more things that we have to do here to make this work. And the first one is typing erratically. When you're in the setup method, you have to expose to the template anything inside the setup method that you want the template to be able to use. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And the last thing is we need to just pull in our reactive and ref helpers. Okay, and with that, we should be back to a happy path, and we are. So not too bad. We totally got rid of the Option API logic and pulled it up into setup here. And we can use a method real quick just as a final example of refactoring. So let's get rid of that increment. And let's show how we would pull that up into, so we're going to have an increment function and, oops, right? We're going to pull in the contents of that function and format it. And there's a few little things we got to do here. So we're going to actually access the counter variable directly. And counter actually is referencing the reactive object wrapping this primitive. So to get access to the primitive, we have to access .value. And Composition API handles refs a little differently, and we'll address that in just a moment. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of this here as well. And we have to expose increment to the template. And I think that should make us happy again, and it does. So let's address the ref that we have on this element here real quick. We're going to need to match the name that we put on the template and create a null ref for it. We're going to need to expose that to the template so it can use it. And we then can reference it. We're going to have to refactor how this is working a little bit. Oops. Okay. And again, we're going to have to reference that .value. And now if we pull up our console here and we hit increment, we should be seeing that reference. And we are. So again, it took me, I would recommend this is how I did it at least, committing to every brand new Vue file or Vue component you're going to create in your project. Just commit to doing it full Composition API. The docs are fantastic. It took less than a week, and then Composition API became muscle memory for me, and I really it's really made my code more flexible just in and of itself. And it's been a pleasure to work with. So, and then as you are continuing to work on existing projects, you can find opportunities like this to quickly just start pulling some of that up into the Composition API if you want to take this approach. So our next phase here is going to be the fully refactored version into Composition API. And now let's imagine that we've hit that wall and our designs and business requirements are requiring us to now bring in another counter. And let's imagine that counter is visually different enough that from a template and styling perspective, really should be two different components. It would be a heavier thing for us to start ingesting some config into that single component, writing out dynamic styles and templating based on whatever config was being passed in. For me, it's been less cognitive overload and less time, an easier approach for me to make two templates or two Vue components that have the templates that address those two visual use cases, but then have a single composable that is the engine that makes the things happen, that both of those components can then reference. And that's what we're looking at in this last little example. You can see here that now we have our two different counters, and each one of those counters is pulling in our composable use counter. So let's take a quick look. It's just a JavaScript file. It exports a single function here, use counter. It's arbitrary, but it is a commonly accepted convention to prefix it with use. But it's literally copy and pasted and cut out of those of the initial component here, as you can see. And we just expose the things that we're going to want our consuming components to be able to leverage, just like we would to the template if we were using an instead method in the template. And in this way, we have completely freed up from a functionality perspective. We've freed up any constraint that functionality was imposing on, oh, I got to make this reusable component so I don't copy and paste code, and I got to ingest some config so that I can do that custom style acrobatics. It's a valid approach, but I found this to be more freeing and a quicker approach, so more efficient. So the last thing that I want to show off today is I've written a little demo app. And it's nowhere near the scale where you would naturally run into this kind of problem, but you can kind of use this as a reference. It incorporates all of the different components I've spoken about today. It incorporates global state, incorporates a composable for reusable functionality to interact with all of that global state. And so my hope is that you can take this little example and use it as a reference to implement these principles if you see the opportunity in one of your own apps. So again, I've got this little stack blitz thing here. You will need to go to the Open Movie database and get yourself an API key for this to work. They're free. It's easy to do. But over here, I've got one that's already got the ENV key set up, and it's actually pulling in movie data. So I want to focus in here, like this app might be the next Rotten Tomatoes. It might be a little app to share playlists on social media of movies. Who knows what it's going to become? But the main point is we're pulling in data that we need to show on this web app, the movie data. We need to store that data somewhere, and then we have functionality that operates on that data to accomplish the goals for the app. So let's focus in on the add to list functionality. So you'll see on the list of cards here, I have buttons that will add movies to the list. And over here on the left, movie list details, that's actually the component that you see here that has the functionality in it to add the movie to the list. However, if you'll notice, movie list is a sibling to the playlist component on the left. They're not in the same component tree. And similarly, I also have a modal here that shows the full details for the modal. And you'll notice that that modal tree as well is a sibling to the other two trees. And so there's no way for the data to move laterally across these different contexts. And it would be difficult, specifically zeroing in on the add movie functionality, to make a reusable Vue component. You could do it. So if I were going to use that approach and this requirement came across my desk, I would say, okay, I'm going to focus in on the button, that add button. I'll make a button component, and that button component will have all of the things it needs to do the things, right? However, this button looks different. It animates. It's got a plus. It's got So this is that occasion that I was talking about before. Now we've got to ingest some config into that button component. We've got to render some different template and styling based on one config and then the other. So that's where I hit the pause button. I go, wait, this modal detail component is visually different enough that it really warrants its own component for the template and styling. And I will just extract that functionality out to add the movie into the composable. And that's what we've done here. So if you see here, this movie list details, this is the card in the main list. It's pulling in use list controls, which is its own file over here in the use directory. We've got add movie to current list. We're exposing that down here at the bottom in the return object. And then our two components, the card and the modal component, are free to now pull that in and leverage the exact same functionality across both the components. Now the structure, the visual structure is not, there are no constraints imposed upon it because of this functionality. So in closing, I want to encourage you that, again, that this is the way I approach front-end architecture. It's not something that's required for you to use, but my hope is that in addition to making great reusable components, you'll kind of click these ideas on and find that right place where, hey, these are visually different enough. It might make sense to make two separate components, and I'm free. There's no constraints on me. I'm free to just extract that out and reuse it wherever I feel like. And similarly, same thing with Pinia. It's a great developer experience to have all of your important data organized into one global place in your dev tools and in your mental model, and have that singular place to reach in and mutate and read from a global perspective throughout your entire app. So that's all I had for you guys today. I would like to close by just saying, give a big thank you to Vue Nation for inviting me to speak, and I hope that you can take these concepts and I hope they serve you well in creating more scalable architecture in the future.
And we have questions.
I have answers.
We always have questions. Okay, so question number 1. What OS do you have?
Mac OS all the way.
Oh, we got another Mac OSer.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all, the polls are going down. Mac OS is now to 46%. Windows is up to 22%. And Linux is up to 30%. So it is moving. The more people that are taking it, the more it's moving. So it's just a fun question to ask everyone. Okay, so more about what you actually talked about than just the random curiosity of everybody's operating system of how does using Composition API and composable functions impact the maintainability of a Vue.js application?
So I think it makes it way more maintainable, right? Because you can make your composable functions, those files, grouped by logical concern. So in my case, I just had the movie store, right? But I also had a modal store. And that was kind of like the puppet master that could control the modal and what component was being displayed inside of it. And then the movie store, of course, all of the data around the movies, but expand that out to a larger application that you built. Like I work on an e-commerce application quite frequently. So you might have a store for your cart, a store for your orders, a store for your product information. And it's all grouped by logical concern. And another thing I wanted to mention, just for anybody who's got experience with Vuex and you haven't used Pinia yet, no more mutation functions is all you need to know. So that was a big win for me when I started using Pinia.
Yay. All right. How do you see Composition API and composable functions being used in the future of front-end development?
You know, I think it's a pattern that's emerging across more than just Vue. Of course, you've got custom hooks in React. So I see it in the coming years being a continued pattern that you will commonly encounter in larger front-end apps, because everything I've experienced thus far, it is the superior way to organize all of your reusable logic.
Dope. And any advice on when to use a composable over a component?
So again, with the component, I will create, it'll be a progression for me, right? So I create the component. I think about, okay, what's all the stuff that I can reasonably assume is going to be long-term unique to this component. I'm comfortable and confident putting that logic inside the component. But I'm also thinking in the back of my mind, trying to see ahead, because we've looked at the business requirements, we've looked at the designs, and we have some foresight into what's coming down the pike. If I'm building something that involves product data for my e-commerce app, I go ahead and I build that global state module, and I go ahead and start building out and trying to think ahead those different composable functions with that reusable functionality. The other way is you can feel free to put logic with Composition API inside your components as a start, because it's very easy, as I showed you, if you're grouping, especially if you're grouping it by logical concern, to just cut it out and quickly put it in a composable function, and it's not a big refactor job.
All right. And I think this does lead in, like, also to, you seem on board with the Composition API. What's your take on the future options of API?
For me, I don't know if we're going to kind of poll the community and see how other people are using it. But for me, it's been a full replacement of Option API. For me, Option API has gone, and it's all Composition API.
I dig it. I'm one of the co-organizers of the Denver API meetup, so I'm like, there's a ton of things that we could be talking about there. Can you use composable for just one component?
Absolutely. So if that component, you start to feel that code smell when a component starts to get really bloated. So it's a great way to just break your functionality up into more manageable bite-sized chunks of logic as well. So I would see that as a completely valid approach.
All right. And your state management tool, what and where is a limitation factor, especially for mobile devices?
So That's yeah, that's another design concern. You might, if you're getting a little bit more complicated and pulling in like using session storage or local storage, if you were moving in the direction of going with the PWA, Pinia could play with that as well. There are patterns where the state could be long lived, and I think it's really more of a full stack concern when you're talking about mobile. Maybe you're using something like GraphQL to really optimize the amount of data that's flowing over the wire to your mobile apps. So I think that that's more of like a full stack concern to address mobile.
All right. All right. And why should someone use const instead of let using Composition API?
I think in most cases, there are very, very few cases, and I can't even think of one where I have used let. I'm only going to use let within likely within the context of some. Let's use a computed property as an example, like inside the function closure for that computed property, and I know I'm going to inside there I'm going to mutate that internal variable for the purpose of generating some end result of that computed property, then I may use let. But inside the root of the function, I'm always going to use a const and try to approach it from a standpoint of immutability. I'm creating this thing and I'm not changing it down the road, because if you do that too much, you're going to introduce the possibility of greater possibility of bugs.
All right. And interesting question here is the script location. Why is it under the template? Shouldn't the script always be above the template?
That's a funny thing, because I see most presenters and most people that write Vue, they put their and that's just to answer that question simply. It's just me. It's how my brain works. Like I want to see the DOM up top and then the script below it. Maybe for a lot of people it just makes sense because OGs are used to seeing that HTML template and the script tags in the head, and everything, and maybe not so many. But it doesn't matter how you organize it, and I just prefer it at the top. And that's the way I've always done it.
I dig it. All right. And someone recently worked with composables and found some problems with reactivity. Any tips for better construction?
I haven't really run into any issues with reactivity other than potentially life cycle concerns. So I think part of the cognitive load when you're constructing your front end is keeping in mind, like, where am I in the life cycle when this code I'm writing is executing, especially when you get into AJAX calls, async calls to go fetch your data and things, because when you're in a composable function, you are likely in the create or before create context. Unless you have pulled in that on-mounted lifecycle or one of the other lifecycle helpers, you're in the create or before create when that's running. And so if the async hasn't come back yet or something of that nature, you may run into what you feel like is reactivity problems when in reality, it may just be that the data is not there yet, or the thing that you're expecting hasn't happened yet.
Got it. And last question for the day. And then as a heads up, y'all, like, will Mike go into the chat and help respond? Also, there's like social media that you can ask questions. So we are not ignoring you. We're just on a time crunch. I just want to say that. Will, you're very popular. You are very popular and people are curious. But last question of the day is, where do API calls fit into your app organization?
Oh, well, that, so here I can actually show a quick.
Sure, let me add it back to perfect. Add to stream.
Okay, cool.
Ooh, we got Inception going on. There we go. And I believe this is still zoomed in well enough. So.
Okay, cool. So let's go over here and look at the use list composable here. I use these for what you would consider CRUD operations. And if you're not familiar with that, create, read, update, delete. So operating on that global store, I'll use it for that. I use it for any kind of computeds. If I need to, sometimes you have the challenge of let's say you're getting cart items and product data, and you have these two big buckets of data. Now you need to go through them and reorganize them in a certain way for the needs of a particular piece of UI. I will put that heavy logic inside of a composable oftentimes. So it really, like, in the back end, we think about database as our core, business logic, application layer, which would be like our controllers, middleware, et cetera, et cetera. Because, you know, I do both, I try to think about it in the same way. So global state, these composable functions, that would be my front end business logic that's kind of surrounding that, operating on it, and providing it to the presentation layer view components. So anything that starts to feel real heavy and is diverging away from stuff that's really about the presentation, I think about how could I organize this into composable functions like this.
Dang, you became like you're schooling us all. I love it. And that is the cool thing about these conferences, is we have so many different people to learn from, and one of the best parts of Vue Nation. So thank you, Will, for coming to hang out with us today. And, you know, on the website has how to reach out to Will, on, you know, learn more. Hopefully we get to learn from him again. And thank you, Will, for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an awesome experience, and hope to see you guys again.